This discussion, which we have with our keynote speakers, has proved to be very enriching in years past, and has really set the stage and given us a glimpse into them into their humanity as they've told some of their stories. I'm delighted tonight to introduce to you Peter Wallace. Peter Wallace has come to us from Atlanta, where he is the executive director of day1.org. Those of you who have been to the Festival of Homiletics will know Peter because he's a regular there. And he has a radio show, which is also podcast, and it's a wonderful resource for clergy. It's a place where you can hear sermons, and each week there's a different preacher featured, and there are interviews. Where's Peter? There he is. There he is. And it's a great resource, day1.org, if you don't know it. So Peter, it's a delight to welcome you, and we look forward to having you with us for these 3 days. He's been publicizing our event also through his network, and we are so grateful for that, and thank you for your presence here.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that we want to say about day one?
Oh, we'll get to it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. What an honor to be here. I did meet Peter at the Festival of Homiletics this past May. I did not know anything about Lester Randall, and I have been so blessed to learn about Lester Randall in this preaching fellowship, and so it's a joy to be here. And I was tapped, I guess because I do interviews with preachers, to toss some questions to these four keynote leaders, and what a wonderfully diverse group they are. And so I'm looking forward to getting some interesting answers to some questions. We just want to kind of get to know these folks a little more personally. So the first question that I want everyone to address is to tell us about your calling, the people and events that played a role that started you on the path that led you to where you are serving God now. You may begin.
Is this yes? Briefly, I think my sense of calling started when I was really quite a young boy, because I was growing up in a Welsh Presbyterian church. Presbyterians are allowed to cheer at this point. A very lively, very active, inclusive sort of church in South Wales in the 1950s, with a brilliant preacher as minister. So that I got very engaged in the life of the church. And then at the start of my teens, we moved house to Swansea. And the nearest church that was really very lively and rather like the one we'd come from was the local Anglican church. So we started going there. And I can never say often enough how much I owe to the parish priest who was there. He was a man who spent nearly a quarter of a century in this parish. And he wasn't a person of great, obvious great charism, but a sense of depth in everything that he did and said, and above all, a sense of attentiveness to people. So he'd pay attention to what he thought people really needed. And a story I've often told about him, we used to talk quite a bit, and sometimes we used to argue. And of course, I was a sort of arrogant, snotty teenager who thought he knew it all, as one is. And we'd had one very, very spirited argument, and it was, I think, a few weeks later when this parish priest took me aside and said, last time we talked and we argued, he said, I don't think I was really listening to what you said, and I just wanted to say sorry. And I thought, my God, here is the man I just about admire most in the world, needlessly apologizing to me. And it gave me a model of sort of candor and humility and risk in a way. So that had a big effect on shaping my own sense of calling. And I still look back to him as a preacher, as a priest, even to the way in which he would conduct worship and think, well, I've been privileged to see what it looks like when it's really done as it should be. So that's a little bit of a glimpse of where I'm coming from there.
Before I address the question, I just want to take this opportunity as a resident of the United States of America to make clear and public tonight that I will be asking for asylum. And Peter will be joining me. So any good Samaritans out there who are willing to sponsor us, we would be most appreciative. So, thank you. Interesting that you said it started young for you, Roland. It did for me too. I remember knowing at an early age, like 5 or 6, that I wanted to be a preacher. And I remember taking my stuffed animals and shoving them in the corner on Saturday nights and making up stories that were based on the Bible reading for the week. And I knew it was going to be so much better than the sermon the next day. I was just so excited. The problem was that I was being raised in a Southern Baptist church, very conservative Southern Baptist church down in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so obviously at an early age, I found out that career path was not going to happen. So I did what most normal people, would do. I became a lawyer, which is the same job. It's just different clients, whatever. But what was interesting, and I guess the point and the person for me was a partner in the firm. Over time, I found that storytelling and that little creative side started popping back out. The call was sort of buried very deep, but I found myself following that creative side. So a couple of years in the firm, I was living a double life. I was trying cases during the day, and then I was going to like these dark, smoky country bars, singing country music, doing stand-up. And one night, somewhere in the middle of one of those sets, I look out, and there's the senior partner of my law firm sitting like front row, right? I thought, okay, I'm going to be fired. I just bought a house. This is horrible. And he comes up to me and he says, "Where is that woman on stage in the courtroom? She'd make a great trial lawyer." And it dawned on me in that moment. I was doing this whole very buttoned up thing in the courtroom and keeping all of my kind of creative personality out and yet letting it come out on the stage. And it dawned on me in that moment, you have to bring all of who you are to what you do. And all of a sudden, I realized that maybe that's the permission I needed to not only bring the creativity out, but that call, like a little buried coal, just started gleaming forth. And it was just a matter of years before I left and went back to seminary. So I have him to thank, a litigator, for getting me to seminary.
I did grow up Presbyterian, and they ordained women, but it was not an obvious path for myself as a young person, and I was very interested in I was a hippie. I grew up in that age. And I was interested in development economics and being on the front lines of justice and whatever. And I went to seminary as an afterthought, wasn't intending to get ordained. And I became aware of what the Berrigans were doing. Some of you will remember the Berrigans. And I realized that people who were ordained went places and did things that I wanted to be able to do. They spoke with a kind of connection to things that mattered as much or more, and I wanted to be able to be connected to that. So it's not when I was a little kid, I didn't have that. It's not a very holy reason. It was a kind of a political reason. But I went ahead and got ordained, and I'm very glad. And then there was another moment when I'm Presbyterian, so we had to learn Greek and Hebrew. And why I ended up being a Hebrew Bible professor is perhaps more important than why I ended up being ordained. And that was when I was learning Hebrew, I realized when you learn a language, you learn a world. And I was learning a world different than one I had ever learned before, if only because you write from the right-hand side of the page to the left in a different alphabet. And there's only 2 tenses of verb instead of 18 or whatever we have. And it was so thrilling to learn another world that I couldn't leave it behind. So I became a Hebrew Bible professor.
Love it.
Well, unlike the rest of the folks on the platform, I did not have an upbringing in the church as a child, so my calling comes much later. In fact, it comes 4 years into the marriage that I began with my wife, Bev. And she attended a Bible study quite unwillingly, held in a home, and while there was presented with the gospel and responded to that over a course of time. Came back one night all excited to tell me what had happened, knowing that I too would be excited. And I wasn't. In fact, quite the opposite. I was convinced that my wife had sold out to the dark side and that Darth Vader was coming through the door any moment. I had more of an experience of Christianity and church that would characterize most of the Indigenous folks in Canada at some point in their thinking that this was indeed the enemy. And so it was a year after my wife's faith journey began that I too was confronted with the need to respond to this invitation that God appeared to be making to me as well. And it came in the form of an ultimatum that I gave to my wife after a year of regular evening arguments that this Jesus couldn't be real and so forth. In fact, I felt that we were in a bit of a love triangle, me and Jesus and my wife. And it was very uncomfortable on a number of occasions. But I gave her an ultimatum and I said, it's either your Jesus or me. And she said, well, sorry, you lose. I mean, it was devastating to my self-image and my confidence. And so I found myself out in the country in Manitoba on a field, looking up at the sky one evening on a March evening and reckoning with God. I knew that I had this experience of wonderful relationship with my wife, and she had this experience of a wonderful relationship, a new relationship with Jesus, and I thought to myself, there's got to be something to this. And so I actually made a bargain with God. Now, I don't know if anybody else has done that, but I bargained with God and I said that if you could transform my life the way that you have over this past year, my wife's, I'm in. And so 2 weeks to the day later, someone talked to me about the changes that they'd taken note of in my life, and I hadn't. And that began my call to ministry. I recognized then not only the power of God, but the capacity of God to engage people where they're at and to invite them to a journey that would ultimately be a wonderful experience. And so my wife was prepared for this by friends in the community that she had made now in the Christian church, saying that they were convinced that Terry would come to an experience of faith, but when he did, fasten your seatbelt. It'll be a wild ride. And it has been.
I love the fact that God is a God of variety of callings, and yet one God. It's a lovely thing. I want to ask, who are the mentors in preaching or theology or writers or artists other than Rowan Williams who inspire you today? Okay, we can start with Terry this time.
Oh, I just finished. Well, I think the person that has inspired me the most is long dead. Was an ancestor of mine, of ours in the Mi'kmaq community, Kisagamo Membertu, who was baptized on June 24th, 1610. And while we don't have much of his reflection on his experience at that baptism in writing, we do have an oral tradition that offered us this, I think, this wisdom, which I came to subsequently. And he said this teaching takes us in the direction of the journey that we've been on, but to a place that we could not arrive. And I thought it was a very powerful reflection on what it meant for us as a Mi'kmaq people to continue, in a sense, in the journey that we had been taking over these many, many years, but finally being able to apprehend where that journey might lead. So he's been a significant mentor for me. I've also just lost a sister, an adopted sister, one who's incredibly close to me over the years, Wendy Peterson, a Métis, who helped me to understand human relationships in the way that I couldn't, having grown up in a family that struggled with its own familial relationships. And Wendy helped me understand human relationships that really prepared me to be more effective in ministry than I would have been otherwise.
I think for me, in a way, even though I didn't at the time see it as a career path, the pastor of the Presbyterian church that I grew up in, which was outside of New York City, I'm originally from the States, was a man of very, very deep faith. And his sermons were always incredibly thoughtful, very quiet, and very learned. And I think that made a very, very deep impression on me that this stuff was worth doing well. So I think that's the earliest. I think in terms of writing, Frederick Buechner, and just because he just uses words so well, and there are books that I live with, and Annie Dillard, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. There were many, many summers where that was an annual summer, on my annual summer reading list, just again for how well words are used. And right now, I'd have to say the book of Isaiah, because in Hebrew, it's an amazing book, and I live with it week in and week out as I preach and teach.
I think the person that has had the most impact for me, especially in the seminary time, was Fred Craddock. If you know him from Candler, Emory, Dr. Craddock was the one person to me that gave me and anybody that read him, listened to him, permission to be truly authentic in the pulpit. And it was an encouragement of storytelling. It was an encouragement of the freedom to bring humor, if that is your gift, into the pulpit, but most importantly, to be truly who you are, rawly who you are. And I remember he said something to the effect of, those who fail to use their language, use their voice, are showing a clear sign of a lack of faith. And I just thought that was so powerful. And I'll tell you this really quick story, because I just saw an example of it just several weeks ago. I was asked to preach a sermon at Yale Seminary, and I did it, and I was terrified because, I have a humorous voice, and that didn't seem to fit at all, but there it is. And a young woman came up to me afterwards and said, wow, I've never seen anybody preach like that. I was like, well, is that good or bad? I don't know. And she said, no, being authentic, talking to the congregation like you're sitting in the pew with them. And she goes, most importantly, a Southern accent at Yale in New Haven, And I said, well, why is that funny to you? And it dawned on me that she was from the South, yet she had no accent whatsoever. And I said, where are you from? And she said, Tennessee. And I said, where is your accent? She said, well, a couple of weeks into seminary, I was told by a professor that, my accent is folksy, but if I was going to be considered in a significant way by employers of a church, that I would need to lose it. And so she went to language school to gut that accent. It broke my heart. It really did. And I didn't know what to say to her, but I finally just said, listen, just don't forget where you came from. Don't forget who you are, and maybe at some point you might find a way to bring it back. And I just was reminded, once again, the importance of just that gift of who we are and honoring that. And it's so powerful to have somebody give you permission to use that gift.
I've already mentioned my parish priest when I was a teenager as perhaps my first and maybe best mentor. But I was fortunate enough for several years to have a regular contact with an elderly Roman Catholic Benedictine monk in a community in the UK. I visited often, I wrote often, and he was really my spiritual director for many years and helped immensely in anchoring my life of prayer and giving me just a little bit of the gift that he had. And he'd spent all his life, his adult life, in the monastery. He'd become a monk at 18, imagine. And you'd think that somebody who'd been in a monastery since he was 18 and was now late 60s would be rather awkward with people from the wider world. Not a bit of it. You know, he was immediate, warm, instantly attentive, and one of those people who made you feel when you were with him the most important person in the world. So I owe him a huge amount. In terms of preaching and theology, more generally, the sermons that I go back to read most often are probably those of Austin Farrer, the great Anglican preacher of the 50s and 60s. I've never tried, because I couldn't, I've never tried to model myself on Austin Farrer because it's a very, very distinctive style and of its time and of its place, which was Oxford in the 1950s. But there's something about the way in which Austin Farrer connects up what he's talking about. And he will make you see the connections in the scriptural texts. He will make very blunt, direct applications. It's very tightly worked. And I've always thought the thing I want to aim at as a preacher is try to keep connecting things, not just blocks of disconnected homiletic stuff, which you sort of push to the edge of the pulpit and they go on the other side and gradually mount up into a little pile in front. Farrer didn't do that. And I want to throw in there also, you won't be surprised, the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. My parish priest in Swansea was, I think, the first person to lend me Bonhoeffer's Letters from Prison when I was about 17. And that began a lifelong passion for Bonhoeffer's theology and reflection. And yes, I guess he's one of the most influential theological presences for me.
I want to ask, is there an author or writer, fiction, nonfiction, theology, whose next book you can't wait to read?
Marilyn Robinson. Predictable, but I am very deeply engaged by what she writes.
Anne Lamott, predictable, but I love her.
I give away too much. I read fantasy science fiction, and Louise McMaster Bujold is a master of wonderful science fiction.
For me, it would be Randy Woodley, an indigenous theologian who writes an awful lot about shalom and the community of creation.
You mentioned science fiction, Pat, and you talked about when you learn a language, you learn a world. I wonder if you read The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell.
I haven't read that one. Okay.
Put that on your list. The theme this week is peacemaking, and so I want to ask, this is a two-part question. In these divisive and difficult times, here we are on the anniversary, the centenary of the armistice of the war to end all wars, but how do you personally seek peace or find peace? And then how do you seek to share that peace, to bring peace to the world? Anybody can start. Or do you?
Well, I'll start. Practices of prayer in terms of personal, but not in necessarily traditional ways. I mean, certainly there are spoken prayers. but the peace of wild things. So I'm very much taken. I realized after a number of years that when I needed a time of peace, I always sought out things that were green and watery. So lakes and parks, and even if it was just for an afternoon away from the hubbub of the kitchen and the kids and the dissertation that needed to be written, I would find a lake, and then there would be just that connection with nature. And it sounds trite, but it's not. It's quite real. And then that would then just allow a kind of a peace and meditation that I realized again after time was prayer. So certainly that. I think for me, the sharing of that comes by the grace of God in my best moments of teaching and preaching as well, but I think teaching. And so the sharing, the joy of the discovery of God's work in the world in odd and funny places and whatever is, and in Scripture and in the Word, and is really the joy of my life. And I think in that moment when it becomes a shared joy, it is the Holy Spirit and peace being shared.
Well, I will dovetail on that because we have similar answers, very similar answers. Okay, no copying, sorry. Oh, plagiarism. I can't remember where I read this, but recently I read this phrase that really got me, and it said, you should live where you pray best. And, you know, it doesn't really, it's a great, powerful phrase. The problem is I live best in a trout stream, you know, or on the back of a motorcycle, or out in somewhere with a big sky, just a big, big sky. And so I have to leave the church proper and New York and get out into that creation. I guess I've always been one of those folks that I don't understand why we worship in four walls, as beautiful as they are. We're worshiping the God of this incredibly beautiful universe. I have to go out in it to be able to come back into the church proper. And I think that's the transitional moment, because when I go out, I'm short, I'm curt, I'm just a pain to be around. And I get out in God's wonderful universe and find that patience, find that peace, that presence. And when I come back, that affects all of the relationships in my life. It affects my relationships with my family. It affects my relationships with my congregation, with my staff, with my friends, with everyone. And then that in turn changes how they react with others. And I believe it's a chain. Because when you come back with that peace and you share it, then others pick it up and they share it.
I suppose for me it begins with just a regular discipline of meditation in the morning, and making sure that, so far as is humanly possible, every day starts with that extended silence. And I've been, again, fortunate enough to have friends who've had some very deep and serious training in contemplative practice and meditation, who've shared that with me and helped me anchor myself there. So that's the core and the basis. But for quite a long time, I was involved in one way or another with peace activism, and indeed managed to get myself arrested on one memorable occasion on Ash Wednesday for scattering ashes on a runway in a military base. Nobody could work out why it was a crime, so I was never actually taken to court. But I find now that where that activism comes through is the work I do as Chair of Trustees of Christian Aid, which is a global development agency. Because, sorry, this is taking it to a slightly different level, but I think it's important that we recognize peace is absolutely bound up worldwide with well-being. You know, that the lack of well-being, the lack of justice, the lack of equity in our world is the driver of conflict, the driver of violence, and therefore you have to go to the roots. You have to ask yourself constantly, what are the structures that are promoting violence by colluding with injustice. And that took me about 6 weeks ago to Brazil for a visit to see some of the work we do in the streets of Sao Paulo there, supported by Christian Aid. And I came back from there with two sensations: the near despair felt by most of our friends in Brazil about what was happening in terms of Brazilian society, and confirmed by the election, of course, and the sense of immense creativity and hope that I picked up listening to what was coming out of the work with the homeless and with destitute families in Sao Paulo, and the peace that was made in one particular project, which was the result of a human rights group taking over a semi-derelict hotel in the middle of Sao Paulo for homeless families. And the families worked as a commune, they supported one another, they shared childcare, they took responsibility for the maintenance and the decoration of the building. And although it was, pretty battered, the sense of active peacemaking was very strong because of people liberated to give to one another. That's when I think peace roots itself.
I think for me, when I'm at my best, which my wife would probably tell you is seldom, in living in a peaceful way, it's when we're out on the land and begin to recognize yet again the degree to which we are bound up with the rest of creation of which we are a part. That we don't live in an autonomous or independent way from the rest of creation that we're part of, but we live in this interdependent, interrelated, and interconnected way. And when I'm out on the land and I can reflect on the fact that I am a part of this, that while I have a unique relationship to the one who made it all by reason of carrying the image and likeness of that creator, I'm nonetheless a part of this whole thing. And that leads me to think about how I can convey that sense of peace, which again is not the absence of conflict, but is rather the movement towards a very holistic experience of life, where health and well-being is experienced in a variety of ways. Then I'm sharing with people about the need to live in right relationship with the Creator who made us and with other spiritual powers. And inevitably, when I say that as an indigenous person, Christians, particularly those of a more conservative tradition, get a little bit of the heebie-jeebies to think about living in right relationship with other spiritual powers. But in our experience and in my reading of the text of Scripture, there are other spiritual powers at play in our world, and not just spiritual powers of wickedness in high places, but there are other spiritual realities of our world that we must live in right relationship with. And so I invite people to think about how we live in right relationship with the one who made us and the one who authored this creation, and how we live in right relationship to those other spiritual powers, not bowing to their whims, wishes, their demands, their invitations to walk in less than good ways. And then I talk about how we live in right relationship with others in the human community, and right relationship with others invites us to think as we've been invited many times in Scripture and Jesus' teaching and the apostles to think of others as more important than ourselves. And I'm living at peace and inviting people to live at peace when I'm inviting them to think of the needs of others before they think of the needs of themselves. And I take that quite seriously as I think about my ancestors who invited people to live in a good way in this land. And by the way, we'd be more than happy to welcome you and give you asylum, as we did so many refugees 500 years and more ago. It's a tradition that the Canadian people have taken up over years, it seems. but to understand how to live in right relationship with people in the human community. And it moves away from binary thinking about human beings to more of a Hebraic both and, which has been really helpful because it's also the way indigenous people tend to think, is it's both and, not either or. So binary thought has been less than helpful in that regard. And then finally, to invite people to live in right relationship with and right relatedness to the rest of creation of which we are a part. My grandfather taught me many, many years ago that animals are persons too. They're just not people. And there's an awful lot about that I think is important for particularly people of a Western Enlightenment disposition to consider that the rest of creation is possessed ontologically of a spiritual nature by reason of it having been created. And I'm at peace and inviting people to live in peace when I can help them understand that and help them realize that humanity is not somewhere up here, that we are interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent.
Rowan, I love the fact that you got arrested on Ash Wednesday by casting ashes on a military base, a runway. And then you mentioned Brazil. I just read the quote this morning from the newly elected head who said something to the effect that underneath the land of the indigenous peoples lies great wealth. Made me almost nauseous. So in light of these activities and the things that are going on in our world, in our communities, what do you see as the role of the preacher in these times?
One way I sometimes try to sum up what I think the preacher in particular and the church in general need to do is to capture the imagination. I think over the centuries, Christians haven't known how to talk about the imagination very much. It's been a bit fishy, a bit suspect. And now's the time, it seems to me, for us to talk freely about imagination. It's where somebody like Walter Brueggemann is such an extraordinarily powerful proponent of or explorer of this dimension, the prophetic imagination, great book. And I suppose if I were asked what I'd want to do as a preacher, it's to try and get to that imaginative level where you can help people go out thinking, do you know, maybe it looks like that. Nothing short of that imaginative revolution is really going to be much use to us because, as others have said, as Terry was just saying, we are in a culture where our fictions and fantasies about our humanity are now becoming so toxic, and the toxic effects are so immediate for ourselves and everything around us, where people in power can say things like what you've just quoted, where environmental protections can be rolled back or sidelined, then we really need to seed imaginative protest in Christian communities. And it's easy to say that. I don't have a 10-point plan for it, but it does seem to me that that's what we need to keep in mind as the big picture here, which is more than simply coming up with a moral vision. Somebody said about the referendum campaign in the United Kingdom a couple of years ago, which produced the infamous Brexit policy, that the failure of the Remain campaign was that it didn't have enough good stories to tell. That the argument was coming, that this will never work economically. And somehow that didn't really get to the heart. People thought, well, even if it doesn't work economically, what do they know? I know what it feels like to be marginal and helpless. This is one way of just, putting my voice out there. And we didn't, those of us who didn't want to leave Europe, we didn't have a good story that met that anxiety, that transformed it, that said, well, actually, Europe, as it existed in the last few decades, may not have been an unqualified success story, but look at what it's done. Look at the whole history of a culture which has, for all its hideous global failings, nonetheless given the world some of the principles by which it can itself be criticized. Liberty and human rights and dignity and, all those things. So we didn't tell that story. We didn't get to the imagination.
I think for me, I would have to answer it depending on the congregation to whom I was preaching. I can't really get past in my mind my own family, my own congregation. If I'm preparing a sermon, if I'm thinking about this question, I see the images of the people in my mind. Oh, there's Frida, there's Jim, and my congregation is a smaller congregation, 75, 85 folk, extraordinarily diverse, about 50% people of color, a large LGBTQ population, Russian, Ukraine, Hispanic, 96 down to 2 months. It's a little microcosm of the world. And many of these folks are in the crosshairs of just about every single headline that comes out. And so I find that my job for months and months, maybe years at this point, has been almost like Burgess Meredith in the Rocky movie. I'm like the guy in the corner or the woman in the corner that just, tries to lift them up and give them enough courage and good news from the gospel that they can stand a little straighter and actually turn and go back out the door and start again. It's that basic. So I think, given at least our demographic and what's going on in our world, that's the way that I'm preaching right now.
Well, you will not be surprised to hear a Hebrew Bible professor say, I think the job right now of the preacher, and a job of the preacher, is to reveal the beauty of an ancient text. The things that we deal with, both Hebrew Bible and New Testament, they've been there, done that in terms of so much of the suffering that we see, and nothing we see, or anything we see is going to be as bad as what the Assyrian army did to the peoples of its day in 720, before the Common Era. And yet you had poets and storytellers and people who wrote down, in the face of destruction, I'm going to collect proverbs. What an odd thing to do. And yet in those proverbs, there's incredible wisdom. And I'm going to tell stories. I'm not going to write lectures. I'm going to tell stories, and I'm going to write poetry and songs. And so there's something about beauty confronting terror that is not going to be enough, but if we don't do it, we're sunk. If we don't allow that ancient beauty as well as our current beauty, and that might be poets and storytellers today, but something about that is a light in the darkness, or something that says, no, those who would construe this world as violence and terror do not have the last word. And so the preacher's job is to say something other than that last word that the culture wants to say.
When I was preparing for ministry many years ago, a senior pastor of a church described the role of the pastor-preacher to me in this way. He said, the role of the pastor, the preacher, is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And there's a certain truth to that. There's a need to affirm our common humanity, and I think that's what Paul does on Mars Hill in the Areopagus. He affirms our common humanity. He talks about us being created of one flesh, for the purpose that we might seek after, reach out for, if perhaps we might take hold of God, is to affirm our common humanity and the place that we hold in God's creation and in the economy of God. And then to challenge our human behavior, to challenge when we're not living up to the expectation of that humanity. I'm put in mind of a nephew I have. His father, my cousin, was residentially schooled, and he developed a seething hatred of Christianity and Christians. Understandably so, in my view, given how his dad had turned out. And I recall being invited to preach at a church in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, one Sunday, and arriving there a bit early to speak with the pastor and to prepare for the message and the service. In his office, I returned from the back, and in this sort of classic two-aisle, three pew block church, there seated in the far end of the center block on my left as I came out was my nephew, the seething anti-Christian, and I walked down to see him and his wife and asked him why he was there. And I said, "Junior, why are you here?" And he responded and said, "Well, Uncle, I heard you were speaking here today and I needed to come and hear you." And so just at that point in time, I was tapped on the shoulder by the pastor and returned to his office to make some changes and some adjustments to the flow of the service. And as I returned, I looked out, and there were about 18 of my extended family in the church. Now, that puts a little bit of pressure on you to rise to that occasion as a preacher, but I didn't try and tailor what I said to that particular audience, but I simply spoke about the need for us to, as Indigenous folks, to live our faith in Jesus in our own cultural context and skin, and so on. And when I had finished the end of the service and had the opportunity to walk back to the back of the church, my nephew had wet cheeks. He had been weeping. And when I asked him later why that was so, he said, "Uncle," he says, "I've heard Christians talk about us so frequently over the years, and I've heard my dad's stories from school, and all they talked about was us being godless heathen savages, and any time a Christian spoke, that's what we got. But when you spoke, you talked about God creating us in His image and likeness, including our culture, including our ways of understanding and being in the land, and it's the first time I've ever heard that." And I tell that story to say that, and I know the others here would affirm that, there's a certain clear sense in which you must know who the audience is that you're seeking to communicate to. And even though I wasn't intending to communicate to my family, I wanted to communicate to the non-Indigenous folks in that congregation a message that said God created us as Mi'kmaq people, and not only loves us that way, but likes us. And so that was important for me, a lesson to learn, that I was comforting a very afflicted nephew and his family, but I was afflicting a very comfortable congregation in their understanding of faith.
Thank you. Well, it's getting late. I could listen to these folks all night. I do have one last question real quickly to end with, and that is, what is one item on your bucket list that you hope to achieve before it's too late?
Seeing the Northern Lights. I've never seen them, and I'd love to see them.
Do tell. Come visit us.
I think going to Vienna. I promised my wife when we were engaged that we'd go to Vienna together one day, and we never have.
I love it. Can't think of it. I think I want to ride the Alaska Highway on my Harley. Yeah.
Well, I think for me, my son and I have had the privilege of being on every continent but Antarctica, and so we've talked about at some juncture making a trip to Antarctica.
Fascinating.
Nice.
Let's extend our thanks to these wonderful folks.
Thanks, Pat. It's great. Yeah.